Let's cross to Johannesburg. Dewa Mavhinga is the Southern Africa Director at Human Rights Watch. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
What have we been able, before we talk about that offer of dialogue, what have we been able to piece together in terms of the scale of the crackdown?
The scale of the security forces crackdown in Zimbabwe is unprecedented. Hundreds of people have been arbitrarily arrested, and many of them have been first beaten severely by the police and soldiers. During the crackdown, the police and soldiers used live ammunition on protesters and bystanders, killing at least 12 and injuring 78 others, at least, who had gunshot injuries. So this is a huge scale. For over 2 days, the government shut down internet and access to social media across Zimbabwe. The crackdown is continuing as we speak, but now targeting well-known activists and opposition leaders, including members of parliament, as well as councillors in the local city councils.
Can you corroborate this claim by activists that there were people pulled from hospital beds and arrested?
Yes, and we have our colleagues from the Zimbabwe Association of Doctors for Human Rights who also witnessed the pulling of patients in hospital from beds to be taken to court to face fast-tracked trials where there was often no legal representation outside the due process of law, and many have since been convicted of various trumped-up charges without adequate legal representation.
You mentioned the high-profile names, I mean, elected officials who face charges. There's also the Secretary General of the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions, Japhet Moyo. He could face up to 20 years behind bars. Why the heavy-handed response to these protests?
Well, I think it is a character of this militarization of governance issues in Zimbabwe since the military coup of November 2017 that toppled old-time leader Robert Mugabe. We see that the soldiers are very much involved now in the daily politics of Zimbabwe, and there is a heavy deployment of soldiers onto the streets. Soldiers are not trained to police or to manage protests, and this is why I think they have resorted to heavy-handed and excessive use of force, including live ammunition. Also, there is a long history in Zimbabwe of failure to hold accountable those that commit abuses within the ranks of the military.
Of course, this time around, we saw those tweets on Tuesday by the president when he cut short his trip abroad. Does that indicate that there is change afoot, or is this just a turf war between competing security services?
Well, what is clear is that the sincerity of President Mnangagwa is in serious doubt, particularly because there has been no accountability. There have been no arrest from those soldiers responsible for the shootings. And we also know that there is serious infighting within the government. And therefore, it is unclear until there is demonstrable action from President Mnangagwa to arrest and hold accountable the rogue elements within the security forces. Otherwise, we have said talk is cheap. What we want is action to show the commitment to the restoration of the rule of law and respect for human rights.
One thing that isn't cheap these days in Zimbabwe is fuel. It's the most expensive prices in the world, according to analysts. We've seen reports of neighboring South Africa offering support. What do you make, Dewa Mavhinga, of the reaction so far by South Africa's government to what's happening in the neighboring state?
Well, South Africa needs to speak up and speak out against the abuses going on in Zimbabwe. It is not enough to focus on a so-called rescue or bailout package, which does not address the fundamental challenges in the country, which are political and poor governance and massive corruption. Even if South Africa puts a huge bailout and Zimbabwe is asking for 1.2 billion US dollars from South Africa, but without the proper structures for governance and accountability and dealing with corruption, it means that that money will only line the pockets of the political elite and will not help resolve the crisis in Zimbabwe. Fuel is the most expensive in the world, but that has not made the product available. There are still acute shortages of fuel in Zimbabwe. The country's economy has crumbled literally, and South Africa needs to ensure that there is a comprehensive approach that deals with issues of governance to take Zimbabwe forward.
Would you say there's continuity when it comes to the way South Africa in the past has handled crises in Zimbabwe?
Unfortunately, yes. It seems that President Ramaphosa, despite having initially promised to put human rights front and center of his foreign policy agenda, it looks like Ramaphosa might now be pursuing the failed quiet diplomacy approach that was pursued under President Thabo Mbeki and continued under President Jacob Zuma.
Dewa Mavhinga, Southern Africa Director at Human Rights Watch, many thanks for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much. Thank you.